finance multiple issues. So we're not really told all the multiple issues, but we are told that there's going to be an environmental aspect to this question. So we're going to begin with CERCLA. CERCLA comes back to the former owners as a buyer lender. You're going to want to take steps to protect yourselves from liability under CERCLA. So CERCLA creates liabilities for these potential parties, either the owner or operator of the property, the owner or operator at the time of disposal of the hazardous substance, or any person owning or possessing hazardous substance who arrange for their disposal or treatment at the facility, or any person who transports hazardous substances. Lenders can take steps to limit the liability if they inherit property through foreclosure or DIL, deed in lieu, that they are loaning, money on the property. So the process for the lender to avoid liability will look like this. One, they'll have phase one, an environmental sites assessment. That's where the commercial buyers need to do a phase one audit to see if there's a potential for environmental liability on the property. They'll assess the history of the property, its use, determine if there's a likelihood the property or neighborhood properties have some sort of environmental contamination. They're going to pull up old maps of the neighborhood, maybe make a 3D rendering of the area, see if there's any environmental concerns that might pop up. It's kind of like a history report on the area, on the property. So if there is a potential concern, for an environmental problem, you might do some testing to determine if contamination really is present. So if there is present contamination, you're going to conduct a phase two audit. That can be a benefit to a potential buyer that they had conducted all property inquiry and were unaware of this, arguing, an innocent purchaser defense. It's probably not enough due diligence, however, but it is like a good starting point. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So next, move on to phase two environmental report, the remediation efforts to fix contamination. You'll neutralize by additional means. So the goal is to reduce concentration levels or move it to another area. So once the soil is contaminated, it is hard to undo it. So sometimes the best way, sometimes time is just the best way to, clean up an environmental area. Next, there's something called a LUS. That's a leaking underground storage tank. So you may have high concentration levels, but if it's leaked for 40 years ago, the concentration levels may become diminished over time. So in reality, banks are still going to be liable because even though they're trying to cover their base with this environmental report, they're still going to be liable with environmental concern because this is functionally unmarketable. Very few people are going to want to buy a property that has a bunch of environmental costs that are going to need to be cleaned up. Other environmental issues, so sometimes you buy a non-contaminated property and someone causes your property to be environmentally harmful, like if oil spills onto your property from the adjacent property. As a property owner, you might have a defense, including look at who owns the material, look at who transported the material, look at lenders, right? Lenders have huge concerns for environmental issues. Lenders, obviously, their primary objectives are getting repaid and protecting the value of the collateral. So the lender needs to have procedures in place to make sure that the property is protected, not just getting contaminated, because then they might just be stuck with this, damaged, polluted property that they might be liable for. EPA does have protections for passive lenders. So passive lender is not liable for cleanup if they get the property through deed in lieu or foreclosure. They're protected so long as the lender follows specified procedures. But this protection is pretty meaningless because the bank is still going to take a loss on a worthless property. So at least the lender's protected from liability, but they still have an unmarketable property. And finally, you can disclaim inheritance for a commercial property. If you inherit a property that just has a bunch of environmental issues, you can disclaim the inheritance. And then it'll escheat back to the estate. And you might do this if you inherit a property full of asbestos or lead pipes or something, and you just want nothing to do with this property. It's a loser. You might disclaim it, and the property will escheat back to the state.